that if someone else comes, would you give me
Sure.
I was optimistic.
Ooh.
But at any rate, we want to thank you for coming, and we're really excited to get a chance to present our stuff. And let me get this started up here. The title of our presentation is Restructuring California Tax Policy in Times of Growing Concern about Economic Inequality, Challenges and Opportunities. And we've kind of been working together for a while, and so what could have been 4 distinct presentations have kind of blended together, so we're going to kind of just jump back and forth, and I hope that's okay. We've got one PowerPoint, and we'll sort of take turns working on it. This is, as you'll see soon, we're in the early stages of our analysis. We're still processing things, still figuring things out. But we've got some ideas, we've got some information, and we're really interested to hear what your insights are, and to get an opportunity to talk with you once we've presented us some stuff. So I'm going to pass it right away on to Shahid, who will do a little introduction.
Hello, my name is Hassan Shahid. Proposition 13 was reputed as the third rail of California politics. It was passed in 1978 during a time of rapid growth in California property values. Reduced property taxes for homeowners and business/commercial property owners. Limited future increases to property taxes. Instituted supermajority rules for passing tax measures that increase revenues. Prospects of reforming Prop 13.
So that's one of our main overall questions. By the way, everybody wanted me to tell you in advance that we're going to interrupt each other.
Okay.
Because we'll forget something or whatever, and so that's going to happen.
Okay. So during the 70s, there were 3 types of property tax relief that were being debated at the time. The first was circuit breaker tax relief to those who need it most by graduating the property taxes by ability to pay, which helps low income or elderly on fixed incomes. The second was classification, which is sort of like a split roll, tax businesses and homeowners at different rates. Just tax relief, it would just be tax relief for the homeowners and not the business side, and not the small businesses as well. Tax limitation, limit the amount of tax that could be levied via fixed maximum rate, fixed annual increase of property assessment. The more affluent folks benefit most from this particular type of tax relief. They have more property value, and their home value often increase more quickly.
Okay.
Prop 13 was a tax limitation approach. It passed with 65% of the vote. It limited property taxes to 1% of assessed value. It rolled back assessed values to 1975 and 76 levels. It it made it so assessed value cannot rise more than 2% per year until sale. When it is reassessed to market value, the sale price, it applies to both homeowners and commercial property owners alike. A lot of people didn't know that when it was passed. And as far as the assessed value cannot rise more than 2% per year until sale, like if you had your house in '78, essentially it wouldn't, all the way back then it wouldn't pass for 2%. And if you bought a house now, it wouldn't be the case though, because you would be buying at the current rate. 2/3 supermajority to pass state tax increases, local bonds, measures, and special purpose local taxes. It made it so property taxes are collected at the county and local level, but authority to distribute funds is given to the state. Current proposed reforms to Prop 13 are, one is to reduce the disparities in residential property assessments, which is what I just alluded to. Like if someone bought a house now in a neighborhood where someone has been living there for over 30 years, then they would most likely be paying a much higher tax rate on their property. reforms to commercial property taxes, close loopholes that allow commercial property transactions to avoid triggering reassessments. So what that is talking about is corporations may avoid having to have their properties reassessed by dispersing the shares of the company in ways where one particular person doesn't get over 50% of the shares. So technically, it's not transfer. It's not a sale of property per se. Split roll is a set commercial property taxes, but not homeowners, based on assessed value with exclusions for small businesses. The last proposed reform would be lower thresholds for California legislature for a local initiative to pass tax increases from 2/3 majority to supermajority to 55% or 50%.
Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about the research process. First of all, I want you to know that one of the things we did at CSU East Bay is that we created an inexpensive, a couple of you know this already, that we created a high-quality survey center and a computer lab there. And that overall, what we're working on is 3 different surveys. One that we conducted last year in 2014, where we partnered with Dr. Jennings, who's here, research methods class, and Susan Ingram was integral to the process too. Where we conducted a survey on taxation and Prop 13 reform. This was done back in 2014. And also in 2014, I was able to add 12 questions to a California field poll, and I want to thank the SSRIC and field for that. And then what we're going to be focusing on today is really just some early results from this third one, a 2015 survey that was developed with a research methods class, and the survey was constructed in consulting with Isaac Martin, who's a good fiscal sociologist. The sociology majors were paid as interviewers through a CSU East Bay faculty support grant that I want to shout out for also. So overall, we're looking at all this stuff, but we're just focusing today on some early results from the survey we just ended in June. So just to give you a little bit of background from the first survey, Prop 13, the kind of a framework to think about it is that Prop 13 was integral to what's now referred to as the permanent tax revolt. The anti-tax revolt that has now been institutionalized in the Republican Party. It shapes what the Republican Party is about to a great extent, and then also the Tea Party. In general, this framework perceives and views government as wasteful, inefficient, and providing welfare to undeserving poor minorities. And their general view is that taxes equal theft and exploitation. These are kind of general schemas that we're working with. And so one of the things we wanted to look at in this first survey was how pervasive is the anti-government, small government schema. Now this many years later, after we've had this this big recession that has called into question a lot of the ideologies close to this schema, how pervasive is it now? And then also, how much does this anti-government, small government schema shape Californians' views on government spending and reforming Prop 13? Another frame that we were focusing that we focused on in the first one is, with the Great Recession, the Occupy movements, Thomas Piketty stuff, which has been very influential in some circles, and especially the minimum wage movements, have focused attention on economic inequality, and also the government's role in fostering economic opportunity and redistributing wealth. And so we wanted to know how pervasive a redistributive schema was, which supports progressive taxes and an active government in reducing inequality, and how much does this schema shape support for government spending and reforming Prop 13. A couple of real general findings was that with social structural controls like class and gender, age, etc., political party and ideology as controls also, both the redistributive index that we had and the anti-government indexes strongly explain support for increasing state and local government spending, and they moderately explain support for reforming Prop 13. Of those two, however, the redistributive index was the stronger of the two. And we're going to sort of revisit this idea later. Also, in the survey, we one of the things that we noticed as we're doing analysis is that Latinos were more strongly support Prop 13 reform and increased government spending, oftentimes with lots of other stuff, controlling for a lot of other stuff. And given sort of the nature of California politics, we realized that this is a really important group that we want to look at more closely. So we made sure that we oversampled in our most recent study for that. So with survey, for the third survey, we added an additional focus on the role of symbolic racism, which we'll talk to you more about in a little bit, and its role in California taxation politics. One of the reasons we did was that in the first survey, this particular item was very influential. Too much of my taxes go to people who don't want to work. And we surmised that this was tapping into the same kinds of things that symbolic racism indexes tap into. Envisioning these others who don't have a work ethic, I think is an important idea there. So, in addition to that, we wanted, when looking at symbolic racism, which I do promise we'll explain in more detail, we wanted to focus not just on African Americans, targeting African Americans, which is how it's usually measured, but also for recent or undocumented or illegal immigrants. And just to be clear, that was language, that it's in quotes there because that was language in our questions, trying to be as neutral as possible in describing, and we may come back to that a little bit. So the kinds of questions coming into this is, we have to ask this question still. We think we know the answer, but is California becoming a post-racial society, right? And so, in other words, is symbolic racism influencing tax politics the way that we would expect that it is? And then also, with the anti-immigrant backlash growing, and some good recent work showing that this is very much influencing the structure of political attachments and parties and things like that. Is the anti-immigrant backlash shaping anti-government permanent tax revolt politics in California? Is it playing a role here in California? And also, is it supplanting or augmenting antagonism towards African Americans? In other words, are both of these types of racism operating, or is one stronger or non-existent? So that kind of summarizes the kinds of questions we're asking. Now, this is just a list of what we're going to show you now over the next maybe 30 minutes or so. We're going to start out with support for reforming Prop 13. We're going to look a little bit at knowledge and different things like that. And in the end, we will get around to some tentative answers to those questions that we just raised.
Okay, so for support for reforming Prop 13, when we did ask the questions to our interviewees, we gave some kind of background on Prop 13 just to refresh their memory. So one of the questions we started as, Prop 13 limits property tax increases for homeowners to 2% per year. When a property is sold, however, it is reassessed based on the price it sells for. The new owner often pays much higher taxes than neighbors of homes with equal value they purchased a while ago. So here we asked them, would you like to keep this method of assessing property taxes or change to a method that makes it so that new and long-time homeowners with homes of equal value pay the same taxes? As you can see, it was about 50-50, half and half, for not changing the method and for changing this method of assessing property taxes. And then the next one, again, we gave them a little bit of background. So many people don't realize it, but Prop 13's rules also apply to commercial or business property. However, because of the complexities in the way that businesses and commercial property are sold, they, unlike homes, are not always reassessed when ownership is transferred. Do you favor or oppose changing the rules to ensure that when commercial properties are sold or transferred, their property taxes are reset based on the current market value? And here we noticed that a lot of them favored the change, so to ensure that the commercial properties were also reset based on the current market value.
Okay.
And then we went to looking at the same issue of commercial property taxes. Some people say that the best approach would be to tax all businesses or commercial property based on its current market value. This would only apply to commercial property, not homeowners. So the question we asked them was, do you favor or oppose changing the laws to tax commercial property based at do you favor or oppose changing the laws to tax commercial property at its current market value? So here, 53.6 favored the change and 36.2 opposed this change.
Can I interrupt for a second? Okay, so this one is asking a question that gets labeled closing the loopholes, and it's very, we try to approximate the Amiano bill that came up, I'm forgetting exactly, a couple years ago, a couple springs ago, I think. And this one, this was a bill that came up in the legislature. So some of these things we're asking about are in play now, right? And this one is asking about the split rule. Should we separate commercial property out from the protections that 13 gives for homeowners? And this is there's a movement, a very active movement that's aimed at through using the initiative process to get this on the ballot, and I suspect it will be on the ballot sometime in the next 2 or 3 years. Okay, I'm sorry.
Okay, so on this question it was, what percentage of voters do you think should be required to pass a local ballot initiative that increases taxes? And this was kind of an open-ended question, so we let them answer what percentage they thought we needed to pass a local ballot initiative. So about 53% wanted, or thought at least 75 to 100%. And 38.3 guessed 50 to 52%. We also asked a couple questions to see what knowledge they had on Prop 13. One of the questions, or one of the statements that we had was national legislation that applies.
You can take this quiz now while we're doing this.
Yeah, so they answered true, false on these ones. So national legislation that applies to all homeowners in the United States, and a little over half answered correctly on this one. We also asked, does not apply to commercial or business property taxes. So only 18.6 answered correctly. It's very low. New homeowners often pay much higher taxes than longtime homeowners of homes of equal value. And again, 53.2 answered correctly on this one. Requires support from 55% of voters to pass a local initiative that increases taxes. 16.3 only answered correctly. And then requires support from 2/3 of representatives in both houses of the state legislature to pass a bill that increases taxes. 40.7.
Okay. And so can I just add a little something here? That notice that almost half didn't even know that it was California legislation, but especially notice that remember how I just said that the commercial property stuff, that's in play now. And at this point in time, less than 1 in 5 knew, with some degree of certainty that was that Prop 13 that those protections even existed. And people who do know about Prop 13, they know about the homeowner protections and the homeowner provisions, and so that shows up here too.
Alright, so over here we have an overview of the key measures that we focused on in the survey, and they also convey the strongest correlations. I'm just going to go through them real quick. We have neoclassical and neoliberal ideology. We also measured government spending, views on government spending, and we differentiated between like state spending and local spending as well. Then next one we have measuring views on tax redistribution, and we also measured symbolic racism for African Americans and immigrants, and immigrants and undocumented or illegal immigrants. And just to note here, I mean, illegal immigrants are like, the term is like, we rather not use it. And the only reason why we chose to use that in our survey is for clarity. For a lot of people, they understand undocumented immigrants as illegal immigrants, and we just wanted them to understand and answer in the correct fashion. But we also measured this, and we wanted to see if there was a difference in terms of whether when we mentioned undocumented immigrants or recent immigrants, and there actually wasn't really a big difference in that. People still respond the same way.
So we did a little experiment where we did a split half and compared, for half the people we used the language, in all the symbolic racism stuff, we used the language of recent immigrants. In the other half, we used the phrase undocumented or illegal immigrants to be as neutral, because we understand that these words are out there being used. And there's no, we haven't looked at it real super finely, but at a basic level, there's no difference. They came in with exactly the same mean scores statistically.
All right, so these are two questions that measure neoliberal ideology. The first has to do with free market policies, and the second has to do with strong government. So as you guys can probably guess, conservative respondents tended to be more supportive of free market policies and less supportive of strong government, so advocating for like less government. What's the next slide?
Okay.
And for support for government spending, so in each item, we asked them for state government, or for all of them, as you'll see, local and K through 12, but formats like this, state government can spend less, state government has the right amount, or state government needs more funding. So 3 options. And when they chose either government needs less or government needs more, they were prompted by, well, how much more? So if you want to think that they need less, well, how much less do you need, or how much more do you need? And we coded for that as well. We had some cutoffs. Next slide.
Okay.
So again, same items for local, and they were again prompted. So one thing that we found was really interesting was that for local and K through 12, the percentages of people who, in the previous one for state government, who said we need to cut budgets for state government, when it came to local and K through 12, those statistics dropped. So a lot of those who tended to be more conservative again, they chose for their local government or K through 12 that they needed more funding or they were satisfied with their funding. So that was really interesting. Despite their like conservative and neoliberal ideologies, they would choose that. So that's something that might warrant further research.
Okay.
The next one. And then tax redistribution. So for each item, top 1%, top 20%, poor low-income people, or large corporations, they were asked if these following groups should pay more in taxes, should they pay the same, or should they pay less? And we had a fifth one, which was a fifth item. We should strive to make incomes as equal as possible. So do you agree? Do you disagree? So on and so forth. Okay. And so our last measure, symbolic racism. Before I go over the questions, just to give an overview of symbolic racism, it's a mixture of anti-black or anti-immigrant feelings and socially acceptable frames for expressing antagonism. A really concise way to say that is that it's a politically correct way of expressing like racist or thinking racist views, or what's construed as racist. And the essence of it is really that certain groups don't live to dominant moral codes, moral individualism. So if you know like meritocracy, or they call it the Horatio Alger myth, where groups are supposed to pick themselves up, and social mobility in that sense. Really the essence of it is that this ideology, this symbolic racism, really they believe that culture is the reason for like social stratification. Whereas like in sociology we know, and it's been proven by so many studies, that it's actually structure that's the main reason for social stratification. And there are four beliefs of symbolic or modern racism. So blank group do not face much discrimination now. Their failure to progress is because they don't work hard enough. They're too demanding. They're demanding too much too fast, so they got more than what they deserve. And then as you'll see, like the questions we ask are really modified by that. So symbolic racism for African Americans. Other minorities overcame prejudice. Blacks should do the same. Do you agree? Do you not? Generations of slavery and discrimination made it difficult for blacks to work their way out. Blacks have gotten less than what they deserve. Those ones were reverse coded, as you can see. And then the last one, it's really a matter of not trying hard enough. Blacks should try harder. Do you agree or not? And then for immigration, immigrants are getting too demanding in their push for equal rights. Most recent immigrants are hardworking. They're unfairly discriminated against, and too many recent immigrants do not learn English in a reasonable amount of time. Okay. And this slide is a correlation matrix of all the key measures, and then it has an index of Prop 13 reform. So I know it's pretty like...
You can start to follow along on your thing.
Yeah, easier. So like starting off with like at the top right, and on the first column we're going to move down to see where it says Prop 13 reform. As we go down, it's a positive correlation towards liberalism. So people who are more liberal will be more pro Prop 13. If you support the Tea Party, if you have views that support Tea Party, you'll probably be more negative towards Prop 13. Same thing for if you're a Democrat, more likely. If you're pro-government spending, more likely to vote for Prop 13 reform. And redistribution of taxes, that's the strongest correlation. That if you favor redistributing taxes among the population in different groups, then you're more likely to favor Prop 13 reform. And the same thing that, as you can imagine, for neoliberal beliefs, there's a negative correlation. And it's interesting because, and I guess symbolic racism, if that you score higher in the symbolic racism scale, you're more likely not to be pro 13 reform. Prop 13. What's interesting is that like you can see the relationships, which is a little bit disconcerting for me. But that people who are against government spending or Prop 13 reform, not that it's a cause, but they're more likely to score higher for symbolic racism, more higher to not want to redistribute taxes. And I think I have one more slide after that.
Okay.
Table. So yeah, so this table just kind of outlines some of the statistics. As you can see, like for Republicans, they are more likely. Not this is. I think there's a typo. It's not government spending index. It's actually is that government? Oh, that's
Yeah,
government.
it's,
Oh, okay.
Support for
Sorry.
state, local education
Yeah,
spending.
okay, so that's the government spending.
Yeah.
Okay, so so yeah, you see they're more less positive for government spending, and same thing with Tea Party advocates. They don't want to spend government spending, and so on and so forth. So yeah.
That's it. Okay. For this, we're not using the full index for the government spending index. We then recoded it so that we could show it in a crosstab type form. Okay?
Oh, this is me.
Uh-oh. Okay. Things are out of order a little bit.
This table shows the influence of symbolic racism towards immigrants on support for government spending by race. What is interesting here is if you look at the highlighted areas, so you see 26% of those of non-whites with who are for low government spending. It's 26.3%. But 40 if you are for low government spending, you're most likely going to have 48.5% high symbolic racism. And if we compare those numbers to the whites down below, 62.4% of whites with high symbolic racism support low government spending, and only 9.4% of whites with high symbolic racism support high government spending, or support, or have a high goal for government spending. And these three stars on the side are the confidence intervals, or no, the significance
Significance level.
significance level. So these three stars mean that it is a 99.9% a chance that we are, like, that what we see on the chart is what we'll see in the population. But interestingly enough, for the non-whites, it doesn't have a high significance at all. So yeah, it's just it's interesting how the numbers for the whites is much higher, like the difference between your likelihood to be for spending, for government spending, and not to be for government spending, depending on your symbolic racism, is much, like, the gap is much wider for whites than it is for non-whites.
Can I add just a little bit here?
Yes,
Is
sir.
that okay? So what I would like to, I mean, I think he explained it really well, but what I would like to emphasize is that this is kind of showing that symbolic racism, at least for views on support for government spending, is a powerful influence potentially for whites. There's a strong correlation for whites. For non-whites, the correlation is non-significant. You can see there is a little bit of a correlation there, but it's in the direction you'd expect, but it's not a significant relationship. So that's interesting. So for the whites, it's this connection between symbolic racism and views on government spending is very strong. For non-whites, the connection is not a significant relationship.
And that was for the symbolic racism. That was towards immigrants. This one is targeting African Americans, and it's pretty much the same trend, except for if you look at for non-whites, there actually is some significance now. So that's like 95. We have 95% confidence that what we see here is reflected in the population. But yeah, it has the same trend. The gap amongst the whites and the non-whites is still pretty large. You look, 63.6% of whites who are for low government spending, they have 63.6% of those with high symbolic racism are for low government spending, and then only 9.1% with high symbolic racism amongst whites are for have a high market for government spending. So when you compare that to the non-whites, like, the gap is, as you can see, is very large. So
That's right.
interesting stuff.
It is. I think we lost the person.
Oh no.
I'm sorry. Maybe we'll come back up.
Okay.
He may be back with some more in a little bit.
Okay.
That's probably my fault, so I apologize.
Okay, and then, so I looked at some of the significant social differences between specifically white and Latino voters. So as you can see, the household income, whites make significantly more than Latinos, as well as have a higher education, 4-year college degree or more. They're significantly older, as well as homeowners, and born in the U.S. Significant.
Can you see it?
Yeah. And also the political differences between whites and Latino voters. You can see that the Republican side is more of an increase in whites, as well as the tax redistribution was lower within whites than Latinos. Government spending was lower with whites, and government spending, same thing, was lower amongst the white community. Neoliberal was higher in the whites. And the very conservative, notice that the moderate was higher within the Latinos.
So I think that last part's pretty important to recognize that Latinos are considerably more likely to be Democrats But a lot of them, and when asked to place themselves on this traditional scale of conservative to liberal, they're going to opt for the label moderate. Why don't you hand me?
I think I took yours.
Oh, really?
But yeah, after. 'Cause
Oh.
we switched. So you can
Yeah,
take this one.
That's right.
Really?
Yeah.
Breakfast, sure.
Okay, that's right. Can you do yours now?
Or I mean,
Well, I mean, you got it, man.
Yeah,
I'm not even
it's your
looking
thing.
at it. Yeah, it's your thing.
I mean, I was pretty straightforward. Again, like just you saw the correlations. People who are Republicans tend to not want to redistribute taxes. Support for Tea Party. Income and education, they weren't really a strong indicator that affected your view of if you should redistribute income. And again, race did. Latinos tended to want to redistribute more. And homeowners and people who were born in the U.S., we also saw some differences there. Homeowners tended not to want to redistribute taxes, while people born here also tended not want to redistribute taxes.
Okay. So now I'm going to talk about some hierarchical regressions that had sort of 4 steps to each one, where I'm trying to get at how much symbolic racism plays a role in some of these tax-related ideologies and preferences, and then also how much it plays a role in support for Prop 13. And so I got 4 levels of variables here that get entered, starting with the social structural variables: education, age, gender, home ownership, race, married or not, financial trajectory. We asked, how are things going for you economically? Are they better, worse, the same? Employment status, whether you're born in the U.S. or U.S. territories or not. We also, at this point, I just used median income neighborhood as a proxy for income, because almost 20% of the people didn't report their income, and we're going to have to figure out, how we're going to deal with that. And the conference was getting closer and closer, so we decided to go ahead with that. So at any rate, then after that, I do it. In each instance, I do it 2 different ways. One where I enter symbolic racism next, controlling for all the social structural ones, and then follow that up with party ID and general political ideology, and then these other political ideologies and policy preferences at the end. The other way I do it is I do party ID and political ideology second. And that way it gives us a better picture to get a sense of what is the role of symbolic racism. And one good way of thinking about it is that I'm trying to show in a way that if you start out with the idea that we think that party ID and political ideology is very influential, and it is, what I'm going to show you is that symbolic racism is as influential or almost as influential. To suggest that it is to answer that question, that first question about post-racial society, no, it's still playing a big part in our tax and government politics. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, but I switched the 2 and the 3. So what I've got here is a series of tables, and I don't want to bore you with too many, but I want to explain to you how I've tried to condense a bunch of information on each of these tables, and I want to sort of describe what we've got here. And it might actually help if I start here. I'm focusing, in terms of numbers, I'm focusing on change in R squared. Okay? So what this is looking at support for government. Is that the first one? I should do the first one. Yeah. This is support for redistribution through taxation. And what this shows is that when you enter the social structural variables, it explains 13% of the variance. That's a decent chunk. What this also shows is I'm giving you all the statistically significant independent variables within that group. Okay, so people that were employed full-time, they had a negative relationship. And they're in italics, that actually turned out to be the highest standardized beta for this initial model, right? The model that just has only the social structural. Negative relationship with retired, negative relationship with born in the US, negative relationship with things are going worse for me now, okay? All those things are what we'd expect. Positive relationship, these are people that want to redistribute, use the tax system to redistribute income. Women, fairly strongly, Latinos and African Americans also positively related with that. Now, once I've done this here, I leave out the social structural variables in all the rest of this because I'm really focusing a lot on 2 and 3 and then throwing in the other ones. So what this shows here, looking at just this column here, it shows what are the statistically significant variables of symbolic racism. For 3, it shows of symbolic racism or political ideology and party. And 4, it's like 2, 3, and 4. You see how that works here? And I do want to get that 4th one because it shows, for example, that symbolic racism targeting African Americans, when you throw the whole kitchen sink in, it is still the most influential variable based on standardized beta. Okay? But so now let me walk through the R-squared stuff a little bit. So you start out with that 13%. And what this shows is that symbolic racism adds an additional, this is change in R-squared, it adds an additional 17%. So the two together are now explaining almost a third. Okay? And then when you add political ideology, that adds another 4%, which makes sense because we already saw in the correlation table that the symbolic racism, party, and ideology are all pretty strongly correlated, right? So they're not, even though this, if I put that first, it's going to be higher. But the point is that that adds a significant amount, and then adding the other ones adds an additional 6.5%. You end up with a pretty large 40% of the variance explained. Okay. And that by the end, symbolic racism targeting African Americans is still statistically significant. It was the most strongly related initially. It stayed related, whereas symbolic racism targeting immigrants drops out. When I add the party and the ideologies, you see that? And then it stays related here, okay? And party drops out, but government spending, neoliberal, Tea Party, and all that. And all these, you can see that it's plus and minus and stuff. It should all be, it all was, hopefully I put the right pluses and minuses in the right place. So then, if you reverse it, and this is what this line shows, is that if you put party ID and political ideology, 16.5%. If I had just flipped it there, it would be 16.5 if I put party and political ideology in first, and symbolic racism adds an additional 4.7%. So, what I take from this is that we know for this kind of thing, for support for redistribution through taxation, this strong egalitarian belief, we know that party and political ideology are very influential. When people think about this, they think about party and political ideology. What I'm making a case for here with the data is that symbolic racism is actually somewhat more influential. It explains more at the beginning, slightly, and explains a little bit more controlling for the other. Does that make sense? Everybody's got, I'm not teaching a class, I'm sorry. So it's this kind of thing that we're looking at in these other ones. And what I would ask you to take a look at is which of the symbolic racism variables are there also in the fourth one. For support for government spending, we see that actually, if I compare the 12.6 to the 13.2, in this instance, political ideologies explain it a little bit more. Political ideology and parties explain it a little bit more. When you flip it. But again, it's not so much, I'm not trying to create a war between the two, but what I'm trying to say is that symbolic racism is very influential. and it's on the same par as party and political ideology. And similar with neoliberal ideology, except here things change now. Now think about what neoliberal ideology is. It's small government, free markets. It's at the core of that Republican Party. The very strong Republicans, right? And the very conservative ideology. What we see here is that by the time we get to the fourth one, that it's symbolic. I actually think I made a mistake there. I think symbolic racism immigrant was stronger at the beginning, but at any rate, by the end, it's the one that's left in the fourth model, in the full model that's got everything. So you know, in the earlier ones, it was symbolic racism targeting African Americans was of the two was more significant. Both were significant early on. As we get to the later models, the symbolic racism targeting African Americans was stronger. But by this one, it's symbolic racism targeting immigrants. I really do think that this is a typo here. And again, the party and political ideology do explain more, but symbolic racism is explaining a lot here. Party identification. Here we see that, and what I want to emphasize here is that symbolic racism immigrant is much stronger throughout, and it's the one that's left. So in some of these things that we're trying to explain, symbolic racism targeting African Americans is stronger. In some, symbolic racism targeting immigrants is stronger. What I believe that this shows, think about what the dependent variable is here, party identification. What I believe this shows is that at this time, that the Republican Party and the division between the Democrats and the Republicans is more related to attitudes towards immigrants than it is to attitudes towards African Americans. And as I mentioned earlier, there's very good research that's showing that in the same way, a lot of us in sociology, we've read the stuff and we know that the Republican Party remade itself, especially as the party of whites, and as the party of racism, especially down in the South, right? But what good research is now showing in equally convincing ways is that there's been a backlash to immigration that has transformed the parties, and what I think this table shows is that it's happened in California, and that's why that's my tentative answer as to why it's symbolic racism immigrants that is the most influential of the two types of symbolic racism for party identification. It's in that nexus. Now, when we look at support for Prop 13, one of the things that we got, and I don't want to get bogged down here, but one of the things we have to think about with Prop 13 is that a lot of people, as we saw, don't know that much about it, right? And so you have to kind of think about people, it's a social act to complete a survey, to answer questions on a survey. And so we're trying to give them cues. One of the things we haven't told you yet is that all those questions you saw, we gave a lot of information as we're going along. We actually asked those after we'd already asked the knowledge questions. So we tried to give people some cues and some information as they're going along, so that those that don't know anything about it, they can let their own political senses tap into this. But the fact is that a lot of people didn't know that much about it and don't know that much about it, and so as a result of that, I think that support for Prop 13 reform, it doesn't have anywhere near the same kind of R-squareds. If we just look at some of this other stuff, 40, 31, 40, 40, right? Here we're only just under 20. Something else I need to tell you about this is take a look at that alpha. It's tiny. This is not by normal, traditional standards a good index, because even though each of the different items, we basically took those items that we showed you earlier and we turned that into an index. Each of those different items is correlated in the direction you'd expect, but much more weakly. right? And so this is a bit of a, I don't know, I might not publish this, let's put it that way. You know, the support for Prop 13 reform index, the alpha is awful low. But nevertheless, I think it's still valuable, and it helps us see some things. And one of the things that it shows us is that in terms of support for Prop 13, it's symbolic racism targeting African Americans that's the most influential. And you can see that both, and you can also see that symbolic racism is slightly more influential than party and political ideology are when we flip it from the second and third that we can see down at the bottom there. But what's most striking about this is that by the time you get down to the end, keeping in mind that in number 4, there are none of the social structural variables. I'm not recording those. That's not what this table's about. The only variable that's there is tax redistribute. You know, people that want to use the tax system to redistribute, and so or people that don't want to use the tax system to redistribute, as we'll see in a minute. So that's a big additional change in R squared there, and it largely has to do in the struggle for R squared. Tax redistribute is much more influential than the other variables. So what this table does here is it just summarizes what I just showed you. It looks at it shows you, I've got the regression 1s and the regression 2s, so that you can look, for example, at redistribution through taxation. That symbolic racism explains 17% when it's added to, it adds an additional 17.1%. Party and political ideology it adds an additional 4%. When you flip it, party and political ideology 16.5. Symbolic racism 4.7. And you can see that there are in some instances here, political party is a little bit more influential than symbolic racism, but in all instances, symbolic racism is substantial. It's almost to the same level or slightly higher than political party and political ideology. And controlling for party and ideology in all instances, it adds significant explained variance as well. So what that tells me, my conclusion from this, is what I've already told you, is that when we look at the big picture here, symbolic racism targeting African Americans and immigrants is very influential in terms of people's views on and ideologies and schemas, however you want to describe those, that are closely related to taxation politics. Okay, and specifically, symbolic racism is slightly more influential than party and political ideology when we talk about support for Prop 13. The other thing that I wanted to talk about or mention real quickly is that both symbolic racism targeting immigrants